3 years ago when the Sony A7S III was announced, it was a huge breakthrough for Sony once again to be able to offer another camera with incredible low light performance. A flippy screen, which is great when you wanted to do videos like this and actually see yourself. 4K and 120 frames a second, 10-bit color internally and also external RAW. Quite frankly, it was groundbreaking in the realms of Sony mirrorless and also other mirrorless cameras out there on the market at the time. But here we are, 3 years on, and after owning the Sony A7S III for almost half of that, would I still buy one today in 2023 after knowing what I already know about the camera and seeing how the market has changed? And you may actually be surprised to hear what I'm going to have to say about this. Firstly, one of the most obvious things about the A7S line of cameras, this wasn't designed to be a photography camera. Sure, you could take beautiful photos with the Sony A7S III. I still do to this day. There's many people out there who say that you should never print photos from a 12 megapixel camera like the A7S III. And to that, I say you're wrong. If you're printing a landscape, you can print up to around about 15 inches wide whilst maintaining maximum quality. And if you want, you can go to half quality, 150 DPI, and print around about 30 inches by 20 inches. But let's be honest, if you're wanting to go out there and take photos of the highest quality, you don't buy this camera. But when you forget about photography and move on to videography, the Sony A7S III is still one of the best cameras out there on the market for video, in my opinion, even over other camera brands out there. And here's why. The Sony A7S III may only be able to output a 4K image, but it's a damn good 4K image, especially when it comes to the rolling shutter. And probably the only way to improve on the rolling shutter of the Sony A7S III is to change it for a global shutter, but if you know what a global shutter is, then that's going to cost a little bit more money. Low light on this thing is incredible. You can shoot in S-Log3 12,800 ISO and still have very, very little minimal noise. Sure, there's other cameras out there which perform okay in low light, but if you want to get really nitty gritty and you want a camera which is the same size as a mirrorless camera, then you can't really get much better than the Sony A7S III. Any hard graft that I have to do when it comes to video, this thing is coming with me. It's easily been the workhorse for videography for me for the last 18 months. And with all the cameras out there on the market, I can't see that changing anytime soon. But here it goes. If I didn't already own the Sony A7S III, and being 3 years later down the line from it being released, knowing everything I know now and being able to look at the whole camera market, I wouldn't buy the Sony A7S III. You heard that right. And here's why. With the Sony A7S Mark III only being a 12 megapixel camera, I swapped my A7 Mark III recently for the new A7R Mark V. More pixels than the A7 Mark III, many more pixels than the A7S Mark III. Sure, megapixels aren't everything, especially when it comes to doing video, but they're nice to have. Plus, the autofocus on the new A7R Mark V is incredible. It has 60 frames a second in 4K with minimal crop, not quite the 120 frames a second with no crop that this camera has. But the A7R Mark V when it comes to video is decent, and it's a similar situation when it comes to low light capability. I'd say that the A7R Mark V is pretty much on par with most other camera brands out there at this moment in time. But what if you want to go to the really nitty gritty of video? What about the rolling shutter of the A7R Mark V? It doesn't meet the standards of what you require. What about the low light? Again, it doesn't meet the requirement. What if you only need a really good video camera in the size of a mirrorless camera? Well, I'd buy the Sony FX3 in a heartbeat. The Sony FX3 offers everything that the A7S III has and more, and it's not that much more expensive in the whole grand scheme of things. Custom monitoring LUTs, for instance, such a perk when it comes to actually doing filming and actually wanting to get it right in camera and see what the finished thing is like before you even hit the record button. I have them on my Ninja 5 and I use that with my A7S III when I'm doing the bigger projects. It's such a good thing to have. Shutter angle, that's another one. Set that to 180 degrees and no matter what your frame rate is, your shutter speed will adjust to suit that. Unlike on the A7S III, you don't have that. If you're filming at 25 frames a second in normal video mode and then 100 frames a second in S&Q mode, every time you go between them two modes, you have to change the shutter speed. Plus, when you have shutter angle, you can actually dial that in that little bit more to get rid of the flicker when it comes to filming indoors and you get them really annoying lights just strobing away in the background. Cine EI, something really new to the Sony FX3 and the FX30. Definitely not a shooting mode for everybody to be using, but if you want to get the very best out of your camera when it comes to video, and you can get round shooting in S-Log3 at just 640 and 12,800 ISO, then Cine EI may just be the thing for you. Over the last 12 months, Sony have really separated the difference between the FX3 and the Sony A7S III. They're now definitely pushing the FX3 down the cinema line range of cameras, and so they should be doing. But when it comes to the Sony A7S III, nothing has really happened. Nothing at all. And when you compare the Sony A7S Mark III to the other Sony cameras recently in its other lines, such as the A7 Mark IV and the A7R Mark V, if you can manage with the limitations that them cameras offer when it comes to video, then I really think you would benefit more by having one of them cameras in your bag than the A7S III. I can't turn around and say I hate the Sony A7S III, I still own one. I do still feel like there is a place somewhere in the market for the A7S III, but I do feel like it's been left behind over recent months. And the most frustrating thing about all of these things is that they could be solved with a firmware update from Sony. Literally, at this moment in time, for me personally, the only benefits I see of the A7S III over the FX3 is that this has an electronic viewfinder, and I like taking photos on this camera with an electronic viewfinder. You don't get that on the FX3. And the only other thing is that I already own the Sony A7S III, and if I want to trade this in and get an FX3, then I would have to invest more money into that. So if you want to savage honesty, yeah, you got it. As always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video and you want to see more content like this, then make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you do, I'll see you right there. Thank you very much for watching, and take care.